How do you attribute that? To what message do you attribute that to? And do you think that some of it is recently that said that you are a hardcore Trump supporter?
Well, I think that's certainly true, but also I'm the person that's in the race that for literally 15 months has been talking about putting Georgians first ahead of the special interests, the status quo, and the politically correct, and those that are here illegally. And I think the longer the race has gone on, it's become clear who is that real candidate that's out there that's going to put Georgians first, and that's Brian Kemp. And we had a big surge on primary election day, and we've been surging ever since. And now the polls, this is actually, there's 2 polls out now that show the race is just a dead heat. And in runoff elections, it's about turning out your base, and we've been working very hard to build that statewide base. Nobody has worked harder than me, and nobody's going to work harder the next 3 weeks to turn people out. And I'm really running because I want to put Georgians first ahead of the special interests.
In what way are Georgians not first?
Well, I want to make them first. I'm running against the guy as a special interest candidate. I mean, he's got all the money, all the lobbying money, all these, establishment endorsements, if you will. But none of that mattered on primary day. 61% of the people voted against that. They're ready for somebody that's going to put Georgians' needs ahead of those people that are stalking the halls of the state capitol. And that's what I've seen throughout the state. I've been to all 159 counties. I've seen the good, the bad, and the tough out there. And people have told me on the campaign trail, we want somebody up there that's going to fight for us. Who is fighting for us? And I think that's a big question for Georgia voters, and they clearly know that I'm going to do that and put them first. And I think that's one reason we caught the momentum, number one, but number two, that we continue to surge in the election, because I'm an unapologetic conservative, and that's what people are looking for. They want somebody that's going to stand up and fight for them. And I have a record of doing that in the private sector, and currently as Secretary of State.
Speaking of President Trump and illegals, since you brought that up, if you were governor in the last few weeks, would you have supported this policy of separating families at the border?
Well, look, as a father of 3 teenage daughters, I'm very sensitive and have very heartbreaking feelings for children being separated from their families. But I do support the president. I mean, he ran on immigration reform and making our borders secure. Thankfully, he's taken action on the separation of the families issue, and I certainly support him in that. But people are sick and tired of people coming into our country illegally. We cannot go to another country and do as people are doing here. It is costing the taxpayers of this country and of this state a fortune, which is really what's developed my conservative 4-point plan. And that one plan, that 4th point, is putting Georgians first, and part of that is public safety reform. And a big part of that plan is our track in deporting criminal illegals that are here.
But realistically, even if that's accurate, and I'm not saying it isn't, but realistically, most of the crimes are committed by citizens, right?
No. If you listen to B.J. Pack, who's the Northern District or U.S. Attorney now that President Trump, he said at a banquet I was sitting in, Georgia has become the home, is a distribution hub to the Mexican drug cartel. So there's plenty of people that are citizens that are doing crimes, but there's also a lot of illegal, criminal drug cartels and drug dealers that are pushing drugs into our country. They're creating the sex trade, or certainly help drive that. They're driving the opioid epidemic. They're driving the synthetic drugs that are killing our children. And it's also tied in with the street gang problem, which I know has been a big issue in the Savannah area. Thankfully, I've learned recently that's getting better thanks to the mayor and law enforcement, the district attorney, and other public safety folks here. And that's one of the things that I'm running on, because we have a problem statewide in that. We literally have tens and tens of thousands of gang members here, and we have criminal illegals pushing the drug trade here, and I'm going to be a governor that's going to do something about that.
But just to clarify, we also know that most of the gang members are kids that live here, that grew up here.
Well, I think the whole criminal illegal is a whole separate issue from the street gang issue. 2 separate issues. I have 2 separate plans. I've got a track and deport criminal illegals plan, and then I also have a plan to stop and dismantle street gangs. The legislature over 8 years ago created the criminal or the street gang database, but never funded it. So as governor, part of my plan is to fund that. It's also to create a street gang task force that will help local communities that don't have resources like Savannah does, or Cobb County, where I work with the District Attorney Vic Reynolds to develop this plan. But there's a lot of areas around our state that don't have the resources, number one, to prosecute, number one, to go after them from a law enforcement standpoint, or to train law enforcement. And this is not a state mandate. This is going to be a resource that locals can ask for, and the state government will be there to work with them. It's a plan that was developed by district attorneys and by state police folks that have been dealing with this problem.
I'm going to skip around a question here and go to a commercial about you in your pickup, saying you might have to round up some illegals. That made good TV. Are you serious about telling people that they should take the law into their own hands?
Well, I wasn't telling anybody to take the law into their own hands. I basically said in the television ad that I was going to do that, which was referencing the conservative 4-point plan I have, the fourth point being putting Georgians first and doing public safety reform, and that part of that plan, which is track and deport. That's exactly what I was talking about. Now, the left went crazy over that ad because they didn't get the humor in it. But really, that ad, if you look at all the points that we're talking about, they're talking about my conservative 4-point plan, all those issues, cutting government regulations, going after criminal illegals, cutting or blowing up government spending. And that's what I've been talking about literally for 14 or 15 months. And we just drove that point home and drew attention to it in our television ad.
So just to clarify, I understand you're saying there was a sense of humor in that ad, but
right.
All of the things that we're talking about with immigration recently, you're not asserting that it's funny what's happened at the border.
Oh, absolutely
correct?
not. And that television ad has nothing to do with what's happening at the border. Let's be clear about that. That television ad was focused on a Georgia-centered issue, going after criminal illegals that are coming into the state of Georgia, that are breaking the law, that are distributing drugs, and that have turned Georgia into a distribution hub for the Mexican drug cartel and pushing and incentivizing gangs like MS-13. That is my commitment that I'm going to do something about that. It has nothing to do with what's going on the border. Two complete separate issues, because that's a federal issue, and going after criminals in the state of Georgia is a state issue.
Do you worry that people might take you literally when they
well,
see that ad?
not too much. I mean, people get, it's mostly the other side that's going crazy over the television ad. I mean, I think anybody that's been going to our rallies and heard me talk about the plan, they can go to the website. I have more detailed plans on our website than anybody running for governor about all these different things, whether it's education reform, public safety reform, what we're going to do with traffic, all these, strengthening rural Georgia, adoption reform, all these kind of different issues. And it's only when you have a television ad, quite honestly, that people try to use that against you. But that's part of politics, and I don't take it too seriously. I mean, the ad drew great attention to our policies, and that's what we wanted. And I'm glad to talk about them to anyone.
Okay, so we'll go to the ad that I wanted to talk to you about, where he's calling you dishonest and incompetent, and this is about the data breach in voter info. We have talked about this before, but what would you say to a voter who would say, why shouldn't I be concerned about voter security since you are the Secretary of State? This happened under your watch.
Well,
and
no,
now
it did not.
No,
it did not. I mean, what you've got is a career politician that's been in politics as long as I've been married, for 24 years, that is basically lying about me. We have never had a data breach in the Secretary of State's office. Now, if voters want to know what happened, I'm glad to tell them, because we had an employee that mailed 12 discs out that had personal information. We retrieved those discs, or documented that they never got out in the public. No one's data was ever stolen or compromised or anything else. And I basically took ownership of that problem, because it happened on my watch, even though it was an employee, one of 250 that did that. Took full responsibility, made sure it hasn't happened again, but it was never a breach. And for him to say that is just he's a lying politician. And after 24 years, if that's all he's got to talk about in a runoff, I don't think that says very much about his record. And he's also the candidate in the race, I would let voters know, that said many times, let's have a clean campaign. Let's talk about the issues. And then here he goes right after Memorial Day, one of the most moving holidays that we have in this country, where we honor those that have fallen. He starts attacking. I mean, he was supposed to be the guy that was going to win without a runoff. So I think it's more of a desperate politician. But voters see through that. You know, his ads have changed. They've gotten worse because they've gotten more desperate, and it's because his polling numbers are bad. He's been falling in the polls, and we've been catching him despite him spending millions and millions of special interest money to attack me. But hardworking Georgians know the truth, and they want a governor that's going to talk about what they're going to do and put them first versus try to tear somebody else down.
So I think I know this, but I'll just clarify this for the record. You're saying that no one hacked the system.
Correct.
That this was an employee who had access to information.
Right.
And then what did he do with it?
He didn't follow proper policy and procedure that I actually put in when I got there. It didn't even exist before I became Secretary of State. But he didn't follow policy and procedure, and there's a report on this. But by doing that, he got fired because it created the problem of these disks going out with personal information on them, and we acted immediately when we found out about it to make sure no one's data got out, and it did not.
Okay, just something about the coming election. Are you? How are you feeling about Russian interference? I know that is there a concern about that at the state level? What have you done?
Well, look, we're concerned about everything, any interference in an election. No one has done more across the country for cybersecurity than I have, and this led up long ago before the presidential election, literally 3-4 years before that. We did a whole reorganization of our IT department, and this is something my opponent, he either doesn't know or he doesn't want to let Georgians know what we have done to protect our system from cybersecurity and that we never have been hacked. But we brought a private sector consulting company in to help us reorganize. We privatized part of our systems, moving it into a private data center where we have better cybersecurity. We now have a network security provider, as well as our own IT people, as well as the data center people that all look at cybersecurity 24/7 or 24/7 to protect Georgians' data. So I'm very comfortable going into the election with our election night reporting website, our voter registration system, and obviously our voting equipment. This never hooked to the internet anyway, but because I'm comfortable doesn't mean that we're not always working on that. And that's a big difference between myself and him. Having executive branch experience, we have to deal with those things 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that's what I've been doing.
I have a question about business development, and part of it is, do you support offshore drilling?
Well, I support offshore drilling. I just don't think we need to be doing it off the coast of Savannah or anywhere else in Georgia. I think we've got really resources that we need to protect here. We've got military bases that could be affected by that. So I think there's a lot of federal issues that would perhaps prevent that, even if it ever got going, because of the military bases and the concerns of the DOD. You got the port. So I'm not against offshore drilling. I just don't think we need to be doing it here.
So as governor, would you take the step that some governors have taken and officially say we don't want our state to be included?
Well, I think if that's a step that I could legally take, I'd definitely be open to that. I think the state's perspective has been pretty clear on that, and I'll continue to do that as governor.
I'm sorry. Before, when you were here a couple months ago, you talked about your plan, especially on poverty, and you talked about broadband in rural areas. Is that still a plan, and how would we pay for that?
Oh, absolutely. Another good plan. I think I mentioned it earlier when I was going through all these different policy proposals. Part of our Strengthening Rural Georgia plan, which for people that are even in this listening audience or viewing audience here, there's a lot of rural areas around the Savannah area. And, I've stayed in many houses where kids can't do their homework at night because they can't get on the internet, and that is a problem. The internet is the 21st century transportation network, just like the interstate was. And we've got to solve that solution. There was a lot talked about during this legislative session, but nothing really got done. So as governor, I'm going to push that to be able to have government ideas and lower regulations and other things where we can free up the free market to really go and provide that service. That is my #1 goal. I wouldn't rule out public-private partnerships, but the main goal would be able to create an environment in Georgia where the private sector or someone like that could do that, and not the government. But we absolutely got to make it happen because it ties to education. it ties to health care, it ties to jobs and economic development, and a better quality of life.
Speaking of healthcare, I just thought of this because I'm listening to this on the radio. Are you against any kind of Medicaid expansion? Are you open to anything that has to do with continuation of ACA and Medicaid expansion?
No, I'm definitely not open to or in favor of Medicaid expansion. I mean, I think throwing more government money at rural health care and is just, that's a broken formula. It's a broken business model. Without jobs, with population decreasing, with no investment, it's going to be hard for rural areas to support their hospital. The only way you're going to change that is to have a governor that's going to focus on strengthening rural Georgia and try to do something about, you know, better paying jobs, more investment, a better tax base, working with the locals, creating an economic development strike team in the Department of Economic Development that will focus on those areas. And then we've also got to free up the market in Medicaid. You know, there are special interests at the Capitol that are holding up, I believe, private sector solutions, and that's what this campaign's really about. You got a candidate that's beholden to them, and you got somebody like myself that's willing to look at those free market ideas to lower costs that would be better for Georgia taxpayers and provide our providers better payment rates.
Everybody, honestly, on both sides always says this, let the free market work. What does that mean in healthcare?
Well,
how does the free market work
I think in healthcare right now, I mean, I have literally met with people that have private sector solutions to parts of the Medicaid that just are not getting an opportunity to compete in the marketplace. But Georgians see that all over the place with only having one healthcare provider that they could even go to. Well, that is not a good free market when you only have one choice. That's called a monopoly. So we need a governor that's going to try to open those markets up to create the environment in our state where those markets are opened up to give people choices. Competition drives down cost, it drives down, you know, it makes people get more efficient. I mean, that's what it's built off of. It's not, and even sometimes you need the private sector to compete against the government sometimes, to hold them accountable, to make sure that they're being innovative and moving at the speed that the private sector does.
So you wouldn't have exchanges at all, because the exchange is the issue where you have in some places just the one provider.
The exchange, I think, would be a whole, you know, Obamacare issue. That's a whole nother issue that's been a disaster too. I mean, Georgia families, as I talk to them around the state, their insurance is costing them anywhere from, you know, $1,200 a month to $2,000 a month, and they have a $5,000 deductible. So this, you know, Obamacare health system that we have at the federal level is quite honestly not working. I mean, there needs to be free market solutions there as well, but that's a whole separate issue from what the state's dealing with Medicaid. I mean, we need to be able to have flexibility where we can bring private sector solutions to government's problems.
But do you recognize that there are a lot of people who would qualify for Medicaid under the expansion? You just don't want to expand it, but you recognize that there are a lot of people who are in that kind of hole where they...
Yeah, I understand access to health care is certainly an issue, but just continuing to feed more money, government money that we're not going to have to that program is not going to work. I mean, we've got to change the way we do business.
I have a question about charter schools, and that's going to take us into the Kegel issue, but I have just a question in general about charter schools. Do you support those in the concept, and what about schools that are not performing and the argument that they're just siphoning tax money away from public schools that need it, and there's not enough standards on some of these schools on their performance?
Well, I do support charter schools, and I'm a big supporter of school choice, but I'm also a big supporter of public education. I mean, I think it's good for parents to have choices. This is all about trusting the parents to do the best thing for their child. And there's many areas across the state where the school systems, you know, the public school systems in these counties and city schools are doing great. People are very happy. There's not a need to look to those kind of solutions. But there's a lot of places where you do have failing schools, and those parents have no option. And that's where I think we need to have availabilities. And even in counties where schools are doing good, we should give them the flexibility to do a different model if they want, to get away from state mandated, you know, government mandates from the state level down to the locals. I mean, I'm running to be the local control governor on education. We have too much testing. We have too many paperwork requirements and all these different things that we're requiring of our teachers and of our administrators that's bogging them down. We need to free them up to teach our children. And that's what I'm going to work on as governor. But when we have areas where we have failing schools, I mean, parents don't have another choice. What are we to do? You know, the government can, or the state can take the school over. I personally think it would be better to give parents an option and have competition in the marketplace with either charter schools, education savings accounts, or things of that nature.
Do you worry at all that some people are just going to always go to the charter school and that will lessen the support to public schools automatically?
Well, I don't worry about that if we have a governor that will properly fund schools like they should be. You know, and that's the issue with the public side of this is the funding model and whether, you know, a bunch of kids leave, can they still survive out there? And I think that, you know, for most of the time, the reason people are leaving is because schools aren't good. So they've kind of created their own problem. And I'm not trying to blame people in this issue. I'm just trying to say that I'm going to be a governor that's going to be working through those issues to give more local control, to cut out some of the mandates. Because when I talk to teachers, I mean, the whole funding salary side of the thing and the retirement fund is certainly an issue with them. But even more importantly, teachers have so much to do now. It's just not fun being in their job anymore. I mean, it's stressful, and we need to try to figure out ways to alleviate that and allow them to teach our children. But we also, as local communities, and I say this as a parent of 3 teenage daughters, we've got to do in some areas of the state and in some communities a better job of getting our kids ready for school. We're expecting our schools and our teachers now to be these children's parents, and that is not their job. Now, many of them are, and I have a great appreciation for that, and I will certainly be a governor that will acknowledge and recognize them for that. But we also can't blame them for having a bad school when you have kids that are just not prepared to learn on day one. It creates a handicap for them that they shouldn't be blamed for, quite honestly.
Do your kids go to public school?
They go to private school.
Have they
I went to public school.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now let's talk about the controversy with,
Sure.
Kegel's controversy about this bill.
Right.
And him, you know, the lawmakers saying that he thought it was a bad bill, didn't want to support it, and Kegel reportedly saying, but I need this funding from this campaign donor. Is this politics, or is this more than politics in your opinion?
Well, I think certainly he's calling it politics. I call it really disgusting, quite honestly, that you would have a guy that's been in government that long and talks for a whole campaign about being so principled in his values, yet he changed them in 1 year because he was running for governor. That's not who I am. That is not putting Georgians first like I've been talking about. And to me, the choice is really clear now. It's like, who do you trust to do the right thing when no one's watching? And I have a record of doing that in the Secretary of State's office. And I think he's just lost the complete confidence of the school choice community, because from what I heard on the tape, he was only for the SSO scholarships this year. He's going to try to undo that as governor. And then he was against that same idea for so long, and then he flipped on it for political reasons, which says to the public school community, you can't trust what the guy's saying. And you know, anybody will tell you about Brian Kemp is my role in the private sector as a state senator and as Secretary of State. I have always told people where I am, even if they disagree with me, and people can have a great appreciation that they know where you stand. What's worse than anything in government is when you have somebody that will say one thing, you know, over here, and do something completely different over here and just blame it on politics. That's what people are sick of.
Do you feel like you are going to be able to unite the Republican Party? I mean, this has been a contention.
Absolutely. No, it has been, and it should be. Because look, you want a primary that vets the candidates. And I think that issue with the tape is part of the vetting process that you need, because you really need to know who you can trust as your governor to do the right thing when no one's watching. And I think the longer this race has gone, the more clear that's become, and that's why our numbers continue to move up in the polling, and I think we'll have a very good night on July 24th.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.